Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, which is on the Speechmatics Speech as a Service platform and the recent changes we've been making to add new functionality to it. My name is James Page. I'm a product owner at Speechmatics, and I'm going to be delivering the webinar today along with my colleague Demir.
Hi everyone, I'm Demir Dird. I'm one of the sales engineers at Speechmatics.
Thank you, Demir. So what we're going to talk about today is the new functionality of the Speechmatics SaaS, in particular the new API, the V2 API, which introduces some differences from the V1 API that you're used to. So we'll give an overview of what the new functionality is, how to access the new API, and then at the end we'll have some time for Q&A. So I'm going to start first of all with an overview of what the new API is and why we have it, and then some timelines that you need to be aware of for migrating to the new V2 API. So we have a new API basically because we want to make sure that the new features which have been available for a while now in other products are available on our cloud service. So we've given some limited availability previously this summer. So we already have some customers using the new API. Obviously, we have the webinar today, which will be made as a recording. And then later on in the summer, we'll be providing notices about the sunsetting of the old V1 API. So this webinar is really to give you some advance information about that and really to flag up that the new API is available now and the old API is going away later on this year in end of November. So the Speechmatics V2 API that I'm going to talk about, it's available from this ASR API speechmatics.com endpoint. So you should all received API tokens that allow you to access this. And then by the end of this webinar, you should be able to go away and use the new service. So the new service, it runs on an Azure Kubernetes platform, and it's currently running in data centers in Europe. So we do have plans to make it available in other geographies, but for the time being, it's running in Microsoft data centers in the EU. It provides the same transcription capabilities as the old Speechmatics products with some additions. So things like the custom dictionary feature, which we can talk about. Channel diarisation is a new feature that's been added. And new features over time will be added to the V2 API. We're not planning on adding anything to the V1 API now. The full suite of languages is supported, so here is a list of them. So new ones that we now support on the V2 SaaS are Arabic, Mandarin, Chinese, and Norwegian, but then the other ones that you would be familiar with are also available. The same input formats that we used to support on the old API are available. And we also provide transcripts in JSON and plain text format. So the jobs that you would submit onto the new API, they're available for up to 7 days. So we keep them on the service for 7 days at the moment. If you have data retention rules that are stricter than this, then you can go in and manually delete jobs as necessary. So we can talk about that. And in terms of performance, we generally aim to have a 2 times real-time factor in returning transcripts. So that means that if you have a 60-minute audio file, we'd aim to get the transcript back to you within 30 minutes. So this is just an overview here of the new features. So custom dictionary and channel diarisation that we mentioned. So custom dictionary, if you're not familiar with it, it allows you to add words that are not in our existing vocabulary. So special words that maybe you use in your use cases, like names, companies, abbreviations, and so on. So you can add those into our dictionaries. Channel diarisation, if you have audio that's encoded in multiple channels or streams within a single file, then you can apply labels, speaker labels to those. And because now we have a single global English model, some customers do want to have different output spellings, so like US or British English spellings. So we have the ability to do that through an output locale setting. So you can get spellings that are relevant to your region through that. And coming soon, we will have an advanced punctuation feature, which basically gives a richer set of punctuation marks. So things like commas, exclamation marks, question marks, on top of the full stops that you're already used to. I'm going to hand over to Damir soon. I just want to outline the new stuff that you need to be aware of to use the API. So we changed the way that we do authorization. So the API key that you use is still the same, but the way it's sent in request is slightly different. It's in a header. We also have done away with relying wholly on form fields for submitting the config for a job. So all the configuration now comes in a single JSON object, which you build up and then send when you submit the job. And also the JSON output format that we have is richer, so it supports more features, and it's designed to be easier to parse and use for your particular use cases. So that's the summary, the high-level summary. I'm now going to hand over to Damir, who is going to talk to you about how to use the service in more detail.
Thanks, James. So I'd really like to cover the next 3 bits as authentication, some of the input through the config object, and then what to expect from the new modified and updated output. So if we look at the authentication first, our V2 API has been redesigned. So we now use auth2, which is really more of a standard for against RESTful APIs. So we've kind of updated that. The main difference is that compared to the V1 API, you'll notice that the authentication token has now been stripped from the URL, and it's now passed through as a header, which is very much different, and it's probably the right way to go about it. If you have a look at the example that we've got through curl, what you'll notice is straight away that the actual endpoint is much shorter, and there is no more user IDs that you need to submit, as well as the authentication token. It's just one thing at the header level, and it works much, much better. So thanks for the feedback from the initial customers.
Yeah, so it's really keeping all that lot of mess that was in the URL, keeping it cleaner and putting stuff in the right headers.
Yeah, and lots of the customers that previewed it, they quite like the way we've now changed it. So that's been really valuable, and we decided to keep it moving that way.
Yeah.
The actual authentication token is still required for every single request that you make to the Speechmatics service. So whether that's submitting a job or just retrieving the transcript, you still have to use it to authenticate yourself. These authentication tokens, as James mentioned, we have migrated the auth tokens that were used in the V1 API just to make it a bit simpler for you. So when it comes to using this new V2 endpoint, you don't have to do much change. However, if you're requiring a new token, you are able to make a request to our support team, and they'll be able to send your new token out, part of your migration from V1 to V2.
Yeah, so we do have plans to have an API key self-service portal. For the time being, though, it would be a support request if you want to change your token.
So I'd like to now take a moment just to look at what we've done when it comes to submitting jobs, especially when it comes around to doing the post. We've slightly modified it when it comes to the V2 API, and there's some things that you really want to consider, as you will have to change your application. So with the V1 API, we used lots of form fields to be able to pass in some of the information regarding the job. And some of that included, this is the language pack that I'd like to use. I want to enable diarisation, and here's some information about diarisation, for callbacks, for example. And really, as we wanted to expand our feature sets and functionality, we just have more and more form fields that we'd eventually keep adding to. And if you're a customer or partner on this call that does use our cloud service, but also uses on-premise Speechmatics ASR, what you'll start to notice is that there is a bit of a drift between how we use form fields in one product and then a different submission method for the on-premise deployments. And hopefully we're going to address that with the config object. So with the V2 API, we've now introduced this shared configuration object. This is only used when it comes to submitting new jobs. So anytime you do a post, this is the time to use it. The config object is really constructed using the JSON format, so it's kind of nice and clean, and that's what we've standardized on the output. So now we've got it as part of the input as well. And it's created from some key value pairs. And this really allows you to add all the features, custom dictionary, channel diarisation, language in a more formalized manner.
Yeah, I think also customers generally find JSON easier to validate for like their own clients if they want to process some data before submitting it as a job. They can bundle it up in the config object and then submit it as part of that, which is easier than using form fields.
So as we develop more and more features and functionality, make it available through the API, it will be extensible through this config object. So a really important thing to highlight here is that if you are that on-premise customer and a cloud customer, what we're going to start to do is have this config object that is going to be common across all our platforms. So that really makes it much easier for you if you're working in more of a hybrid mode. You'll have one config object that you validated and tested, and you can use it on-premise, in the cloud, anywhere else. And this wasn't really possible with the method of using form fields. So it should really simplify lots of your codes. The other thing, unlike form fields, the config object is validated upon request, which is quite nice. What this really means for you, you will have to refactor some of your code. So for any features that you used in the V1 API, you will have to take, for example, diarisation or callbacks. You'll have to take that from the form fields and basically put it into this JSON object. It is a tiny bit of work, but it should make your life easier in the future. And while you are doing that, some of that work, it might be worth trying out some of the additional functionality that we offer through the V2 API. So just take a moment just to play around with the custom dictionary and channel diarisation while you're constructing your config object.
Yeah, so we're not going to talk about that specifically in this webinar, but if you go to the docs, you'll see some examples about how to use those features.
And we will provide the documentation straight after this, so you'll be able to look at all the other functionality that's available. There's just one thing I want to highlight on the left-hand side for the config.json. The most basic thing that you need is just the language, and then everything else would be a key value pair underneath. If we now take a moment to look at how we deal with a config object in terms of job submission, what you'll notice is that there is a big difference between the V1 and V2 API. With the V2, it's first of all, you'll notice that the post request, the URL once again is much shorter, much cleaner. There's no auth token and user IDs. But we only need two form fields. One is the data file for your media file, whether that be audio or video. And the second form field is a config object that wraps everything up in one. So really powerful, really simple. And finally, once you do submit the job, there is a slight change in terms of what we return as part of a response. So previously, when you posted a job in the V1 API, we always waited for the file to be completely uploaded by the service. We would send you a 200 OK, at which point you'd be able to get a data block back with your job ID, the duration, and all the other good stuff. With a V2, we've kind of changed it slightly. We no longer give you a 200 response, but we will give you a 201. And that really just indicates that Speechmatics have accepted the job and it has been created. And to be fair, 201 is probably a more suitable code for what we're doing right now. So it's a nice change.
Yeah, it's more correct from the REST API point of view that it's still a success code. It's just indicating that yes, your job's been successfully accepted. If there are issues with the job further on down the line, that'll be returned in the job status, which you can access through the job info and list jobs requests.
Yeah, and as we've been talking, what you've probably done is looked at the screen and identified that there is a bit of a change between the actual body in the response. The V1 really takes out some of the information that's probably not used by many customers, including the balance, the check weight, and the cost. So now we just provide you with a ID. In the V2, what you will notice is that the job ID has now gone from a completely numerical value into an alphanumerical, so it's a digits as well as letters. So that's nice and straightforward. Looking about some of the other bits of information that you get in the response headers, we have added a few more bits of information. For example, if you look at the request ID, we're now able to track your whole job through the system. So when you do get these responses back, and you experience a problem, providing us the request ID would be helpful in troubleshooting your issue, especially when it comes to raising a ticket with our support team.
Yeah.
So that really is some of the input. So there are obviously a few changes that you will have to make, but hopefully in the long run, they will be much better for you. If we now take a moment to look at what's changed in the output, not much has really changed, apart from, yes, we still provide you with a pure textual output of the transcript, what everybody was used to with the V1 API, fantastic. And in the V2 API, we've now updated our JSON schema to provide a lot more metadata. The V1 API that had the output, that JSON output is no longer compatible. So this next section might be just important to listen to, as you're going to have to deal with it much differently. So some of the main differences is how we've started to wrap up some of our data in terms of the output. The schemas are slightly different, and there are still 4 sections between or elements between the V1 and V2 output. But if we take a look at it a bit more closely, what we're really looking at is, first of all, we'll provide you with the format, which is moved from the bottom of the file to the top. That's a nice simple change, but really nothing that should make any drastic code changes. If you look at the V2 JSON output, you'll notice that the bit in pink that should be the screen, this is metadata generated by our engine. So when you submit the job, we start to add some of this information which you may need. You'll still find the job ID, date created, and time, which is absolutely useful. And that really matches some of the V1. So once again, there's not really much that you have to do from an application perspective. As we move down, the metadata block in the V2 output is one that's probably going to be really useful for many customers. What this really tells you is all the information that you submitted through the job config, and we take that and now we output it in your transcript. So when it comes at a later point and you're wondering what settings or what parameters you used for the job submission, well, it's now there in the actual output, so it might make your life much easier. And finally, the 4th section in the new output is we've took speakers and words and we've now put them under the results element. This is really where a few smaller tweaks will have to be made. It's just how you would parse your file to be able to get some of the valuable information out to what you've already been doing. And now if we actually look at the results kind of body of the JSON output, what you'll notice is that we've now got a alternatives list. we've actually future-proofed this particular schema, so the alternatives will always provide one output of a word. And for that one word, it will once again give you all that useful information like the confidence score and the speaker identification. What you will notice that on a per word basis, we give you the speaker label. So whether you use normal diarisation or channel diarisation, that label will be there, and you're not having to look at two parts of a JSON file, look at the timings and try and match everything up. So it is much cleaner. Also, for each individual word, we do provide you with a start and end time, and the duration has now gone. We used to provide you with that, oh, this took 2 seconds to say the particular word. Some customers actually took that information and added it to create their own end time. So now we have here's the start time of the word and here's the end time. So there's a clear distinction between the two. And finally, we've now introduced a new type object. What this will actually allow you to identify is whether the word that we've recognized through the output is actually a word or if it's something like punctuation. So if you don't really want to parse any of the punctuation, you can look at the type key value pair and just not display it in the actual output. So really how you parse the file is still very similar to the V1, but it's just looking at different bits of information.
Yeah, I mean that's part of the whole future proofing of the API that Damir was alluding to earlier. So in the future, we may have other types of results that would appear, so like non-speech elements in the stream and so on. So it allows us to basically to grow the API in a much easier way.
Yeah, so this has been a bit of a major revamp in terms of the output, but it does make it much cleaner and a bit more future-proof for you as well, especially something like the alternatives. As we look at new features and functionality, we can do something in the background, but really you're not having to redesign your code base and look at how you parse that data. And just before I hand you over to James, there's one additional bit of functionality that we've added, which most of you will be happy to hear. We've got the ability to add your own tracking information, so your own custom labels, key value pairs, tags, whatever information you want. You're able to put everything, this tracking information, within the config object, send it to our engine, and you'll now get it part as well as a transcript. You've got some additional metadata. We previously had something similar in the V1 API. However, it was slightly limited to 124 characters. You couldn't really define some of your key value pairs. You couldn't do lists. So this really is stretching what you can do beforehand.
Yeah, so if you have your own like object format for your metadata, you can encode that in JSON and then put it in that details section.
Exactly. Some of the tracking information, you know, if you're wanting to get the transcript, parse it, put it straight into a CRM system, well, all that information can be wrapped up straight away. So, you know, for example, maybe the customer IDs, any other relevant information.
Yeah, and that information is then available whenever you query the job or when you get the transcript back, it'll be available.
So I'll pass you back over to James, who will tell you about some of the other functionality and enhancements.
Okay, thank you very much, Damir. So what Damir's covered in that section was really the basics of how to get started with the API. So how to submit a job, how to get back a transcript. So there's other things like getting job info, deleting jobs, listing jobs that you can also do. I would recommend you reference the docs to find out how to do that. But what Damir showed you should get you going and allow you to actually start submitting content to the new API. That workflow that he described was really very much a polling type of workflow where you periodically would expect to make a request to the API to see if your job's finished yet, which is actually quite an inefficient way of getting back your transcripts because you don't necessarily know when the transcript's going to be finished, and you may make a request and get back well, it would be a 404 error if the job wasn't available yet. A more efficient way of doing this, and the way we'd recommend generally that you get back transcripts, is to set up a callback notification. So what we have the ability to do once the transcript is complete is to send a HTTP request to a service that you operate, and that can send the transcript to a web server basically that you run, and that avoids the need for you to poll for jobs. It's a much cleaner, less complex way of getting transcripts back, and it then allows you to make your workflow much more efficient. So you're not wasting bandwidth by repeatedly requesting something that's not available yet. As soon as the job is available, you'll receive a callback notification, and you can then process that transcript once you receive it. So here's an example flow. So you would submit a job in the normal way. As part of the config, you would specify the location of the callback server. So we'll see an example in a minute. And then once Speechmatics is finished processing the job and the transcript is available, that transcript can then be sent via an HTTP post to a callback server that you run. And then you can use that to update your workflow. So that's the high level. If we look next at an example, you'll see that there's a new section called the notification config section, which you have in your config object when you submit your job. And that contains some information about where to send the callback. So the most important thing is the URL, which is the URL on your callback service that you're going to run. So you can also specify the payload that you want to send to that callback URL. So typically that would be a transcript, but if you want to, you can just send back the job info, or you can even send back the audio data. And the trigger will send, when a job is complete, will send either a post or a put request. It's up to you, it depends on what your callback server expects. In addition to that information in the payload, we'll also encode the job ID and the status as query parameters in the request. And finally, if you're, we would recommend that you apply a whitelist to your callback service to protect it. And if you do, you should allow these two IP addresses to access your callback service. So these are the Speechmatics SaaS egress IP addresses that you'll see requests coming from. So in this example, we're sending a plain text transcript back to this example.com callback service, and it's going to use a put method to do that. So let's see what that would look like when it arrives on the callback service. So this is what your service would expect to see. So as you can tell, there's a job ID, which is appended as a query string parameter. Status, so it was a successful job transcription. There's some header information that might be useful. The user agent is always going to be Speechmatics API v2. And there in the body of the request, you see the plain text transcript. So obviously, if it was a JSON transcript, then you get a JSON object in the body. Now, the callbacks that we support in v2 are more flexible than they were in v1. So you can send multiple callbacks to different endpoints. So if you want to send job info to one service and the transcript to another, you can do that. And you can also add your own auth headers in the callback as well. So if you've protected your service with authentication, you can encode that when you set up the notification config. So that's all I wanted to talk about with regard to callback notifications. I do just want to say something briefly about performance criteria. So as mentioned previously, we aim to get a transcript back within half the time of the audio length. So an example there is if you have a 12-minute audio, we should get the transcript back to you within 6 minutes. For very short files, less than 3 minutes, that may not be possible, basically because the additional overhead of the setting up the HTTP request and setting up the job. But generally for most jobs, this 0.5 real-time factor you'd expect to see. And the turnaround times generally would be more predictable than they were with the V1 API, just because of the architecture changes. Okay, so that's all I wanted to cover really in today's webinar. This is really just the basic information to get you started with using it. I would invite you at this stage to start looking at the online documentation, which is available on this link that you see. And you should then, using the API token that we've sent to you, you should then be able to submit jobs, you should be able to list jobs, and also retrieve the job info and transcripts. And that's all discussed in the docs with examples. So you should be able to quite easily get set up with that. You should also, when you submit some jobs, check that the transcript format you're getting back is as you'd expect. And it's probably worth deciding whether you want to use a callback notification to get your transcripts, or whether you want to poll for jobs. I would ask you to have a look at your existing V1 client implementation and have a think about how you would modify that to use the V2 input and output formats, so the config object and then the JSON output format. And also at that time, it's probably also worthwhile trying out some of the new features like custom dictionary and seeing if they're valuable, whether you want to go ahead and use them. And we can provide help if you've got questions about those. You should then, once you've figured out how to use the new API, then should start beginning planning to move from the V1 to the V2 APIs ahead of our November sunset for the V1 API. And we'll be available to help you on that journey. And we also intend to offer follow-on sessions to this one to answer specific questions and provide advice about doing that. Finally, if you get questions that you aren't in the docs or you find problems, it's worth noting that generally customers who've used the service today and have found problems, it's generally been something fairly straightforward, like just the auth token has been incorrect, or maybe the headers were not correct. Obviously, go back to the docs and make sure that your example matches what's in the documentation. One thing you should be aware of is you can't mix the V1 and V2 request schemes for the same jobs. So if you submit an audio file using the V2 API, it's not available using a V1 call and vice versa. So you can use the two services in parallel if you want, but bear in mind that if you submit a job through one API, it won't be available through the other one. If you have problems, then technical problems, then raise them through the normal support channel, which is support@speechmatics.com, and state that you're using the V2 API, and also try and provide, if possible, the response headers that you get back when you see a failure. So in particular, the request ID is very useful for our support engineers to find out what's happened. So I'd expect you probably have a few questions at this stage. So if there are any questions, then we're happy to answer them in the remaining time. Some questions that people have raised previously, and common issues that people find available on this FAQ. So for example, what's the best way of finding out when a job completes? Ideally, you would use a notification callback, so using the notification configs object to set up a post or a put request to a web service that you run. As mentioned, that's a more efficient way than polling the service continually. If you are going to use a callback service, then we'd recommend that you apply some sort of authentication to make sure that only the Speechmatics SaaS is able to send requests to it. So an easy way of doing that is applying a whitelist. So if you have a firewall, then make sure that only these IP addresses are able to send requests. And also, if you have a complex workflow and you're using Speechmatics as part of that, then we'd recommend looking at using the metadata object and including additional information about the job or the asset so that you can track it when the job is submitted and transcribed. So I think that's all I wanted to cover. Damir, unless you have any other things you think I've forgotten?
No, I think we're all good.
Good.
Just questions?
Yeah. So if we have any questions, we can answer those now. Okay, so there's a question about documentation. So if I just skip back to the next steps slide, slide 22, you can access the documentation through this link at the top. So asr.api.speechmatics.com/v2/docs. That includes comprehensive documentation about the API and also provides some examples how to use it and also some recommendations when you're moving from V1 to V2 about how to do that. Okay, so we have another question here about the JSON config. Okay, so so we provide the ability, if you, rather than posting a file from your client, you can pull a file from some external storage like an Amazon S3 bucket or an Azure file blob. If it's an HTTP source for your content, then you can include a fetch URL in your JSON config object. And again, you can provide information about authentication as part of that. So if you need particular auth headers to access that, you can specify that all in the job config. Okay, another question here about sending data. Okay. Right, I'm just trying to read that. So is there a way of pushing requests fast on the server? Okay. Okay, so I think that's referring to a way of splitting up requests, possibly. So the question here is sending the data URL parameter is as fast as sending a file. Okay, yeah. So I guess if you have a, it depends on the quality of your link. So generally, like a link to an S3 or an Azure file system is very fast. So yeah, you'd expect that would generally be faster than pushing a file from your local workstation. So yeah, for high performance throughput of jobs, we would certainly recommend that you use a highly available file storage like a cloud service like Amazon's, for example, to provide that file store.
The next question is regarding some of the code that we have on our GitHub page with the Ruby gem support, the V2. I think the plan is to change.
Yeah, so that's the GitHub page that we have. So yeah, we're currently in the process of modifying those examples. So I think we have examples in Ruby, JavaScript, Python, and C#, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah, we do plan to create modified versions of those to show you how to use V2 from those client bindings and others in future as well. So yeah, if you've got specific requests about particular client programming languages you use or frameworks that you use, we'd be very welcome to hear those so we can prioritize those. Okay, I think that's all the questions we have today. If you do have other questions that you'd like to talk to us about, not so much technical problems, but maybe questions about the product, about the webinar that we gave today, maybe some feedback about the webinar, then the best way to do that is through the early access email address that you can see on the slide there. So early-access@speechmatics.com. we'd really welcome any questions or feedback that you can provide to us. So thanks very much for your time today, and yes, I'd be really keen to hear how you get on with the new API, and yeah, we're here to answer any questions you have about it.
Thanks very much for your time.